In today's world, strength is often worn as a mask, fake confidence, fake ambition, and even fake kindness. But here's the truth. No matter how hard someone tries to hide it, weakness always finds a way to expose itself. And one man who understood this better than anyone else was Niccolo Machiavelli. He was surrounded by liars, manipulators, and opportunists, and in his high-stakes environment, he couldn't afford to make mistakes. He needed to identify true strength, and more importantly, he needed to spot weakness before it could ever become a threat. Machiavelli's genius lay not just in knowing the surface-level behaviors of people, but in understanding the subtle cracks that often go unnoticed. It's these cracks that reveal a man's true nature. Weakness, according to Machiavelli, doesn't announce itself. It slips through the cracks quietly, stealthily, like a shadow waiting to strike when you least expect it. And here's the kicker. Once you know how to spot these cracks, you gain an edge. Whether in the world of business, politics, or even personal relationships, knowing how to identify weakness is like holding a weapon without ever needing to use it. Now the question is, what are the subtle behaviors that expose weak men? What tells us, without a doubt, that someone is more talk than substance? Machiavelli identified 3 telltale signs, behaviors so obvious to him, yet so easily missed by the untrained eye. These behaviors don't scream for attention. They whisper their secrets, waiting for someone to truly understand. And once you do, it's like flipping a switch. In this video, we will unravel these 3 behaviors that instantly expose weak men, according to Machiavelli's unmatched insight. Get ready to see the cracks in the facade, the hidden patterns that tell you exactly who's strong and who's only pretending. Let's dive into the first behavior, the one that often goes unnoticed but speaks volumes about a man's insecurity. The first behavior, over-justification, weakness, revealed in words. Now let's start with the first subtle behavior that instantly exposes weak men, the need to over-justify. This is a trait so common yet so easily overlooked. A man who constantly over-explains himself isn't confident in his actions. He's begging for validation, trying to convince himself that what he's doing is acceptable. Over-justification is a smokescreen for fear. It's the weakness that lurks beneath a facade of reason. A strong man, on the other hand, doesn't need to over-explain. He makes decisions, stands by them, and lets them speak for themselves. He understands that true power doesn't require justification. It requires conviction. When Machiavelli observed men in positions of authority, he saw it clearly. The truly powerful said little, but did much. A prince who was sure of his power didn't need to explain his every move. He acted with authority, and that silence spoke louder than any words could. But the weak man, he needs everyone around him to agree. He over-explains, justifying every action, seeking approval for every choice, because deep down he's afraid. Afraid of rejection, afraid of judgment, and most of all, afraid of being seen for what he really is, a man who lacks the internal strength to stand alone. Machiavelli was acutely aware of this dynamic. He saw it often in the courts and the streets. Ministers, merchants, and those pretending to wield power were the ones who talked constantly, justifying their actions to anyone who would listen. They weren't interested in truth. They were interested in being liked. They needed the approval of others to feel confident in themselves. And this need for validation was a telltale sign of weakness. When you encounter a man who needs to over-justify himself, understand that it's not confidence you're hearing. It's a man who can't stand in silence. He fears being rejected, so he fills the air with words, hoping to convince others and himself that his actions are reasonable. But the reality is that he's too insecure to stand by his decisions without seeking external approval. And here's the thing, power doesn't require validation. The truly powerful men operate in silence. They don't need anyone's permission to move forward. They just move. If you want to see this behavior for yourself, pay attention the next time someone keeps explaining their opinion or trying to convince you of their reasoning. What you're witnessing is not strength. It's an inner collapse in slow motion. The second behavior, weaponized niceness, the mask of submission. The second behavior that exposes weak men is what Machiavelli called weaponized niceness. This is by far the most dangerous form of weakness because it wears a smile. You see, most people believe that niceness is a virtue, but Machiavelli understood that it could be the weapon of the weak. A strong man can be kind, but his kindness is deliberate, selective, and never at the expense of his self-respect. A weak man, however, tries to please everyone. He's constantly agreeing, always avoiding conflict, staying silent when he should speak, and apologizing, not because he's wrong, but because he's scared. He wants to be liked so badly that he sacrifices his integrity to make others comfortable. But here's where it gets interesting. When this niceness fails to gain him the approval he craves, it quickly turns into something else: resentment. The weak man becomes bitter, sarcastic, passive-aggressive. Why? Because his niceness was never kindness. It was submission disguised as virtue. He doesn't really want to be kind. He just wants to be accepted. Machiavelli saw this behavior in many men, particularly those who wore the mask of friendship while secretly harboring deep insecurities. He wrote, "A prince must know how to do wrong and not use it unless compelled." In other words, restraint is not the same as fear. Restraint is about control, power, and knowing when to hold back. Weak men, on the other hand, act nice because they are afraid of rejection. They need to keep the peace at all costs, even if it means sacrificing their own self-respect. When you encounter a man who is constantly agreeing, overly accommodating, and always trying to please, understand this. Niceness is his armor, and when that armor cracks, he becomes a different person entirely. He will flip from being agreeable to being bitter, and his loyalty will crumble under the slightest pressure. This behavior is dangerous because it signals that the man cannot be trusted with power. Real power requires boundaries. It requires the ability to say no, to face tension, and to set limits without fear of judgment. A weak man who can't stand tall on his own will always bow to others, hoping no one steps on him. But the moment he is tested, his loyalty will break, and that's when you'll see the true cost of weaponized niceness. The third behavior: display addiction, the craving for attention. And now we come to the third behavior, the most desperate and humiliating of them all. This one is easy to spot, yet often overlooked. The man who needs to be seen. This is the display addict. He's the one who posts constantly, exaggerates every win, and turns every moment into a performance. He needs to be the center of attention, and without it, he feels invisible, insignificant. Machiavelli observed this behavior in many men, especially those whose identity was fragile. These were the men who feared being forgotten. They couldn't stand silence because it meant irrelevance. They believed that if they weren't constantly being praised, noticed, or talked about, they didn't matter. And that fear, that deep, gnawing fear of obscurity, is one of the most dangerous forms of weakness. But the reality is, display addiction isn't confidence. It's the panic response of someone who has no internal foundation. They fear that if they aren't being acknowledged, their value disappears. This is why these men will do anything for attention: lie, embellish, betray, manipulate. As long as someone is watching, they're willing to sacrifice their integrity to stay relevant. Machiavelli knew that these men were liabilities. They would turn on you the moment they felt ignored or sidelined. These were the men who would betray allies, expose secrets, and manipulate their way to the spotlight. Because for them, silence meant death and stillness meant irrelevance. They craved validation so much that they were willing to sacrifice everything to feel seen. And here's the crucial point. Machiavelli saw these men as puppets, easy to control. He understood that the best way to ruin them wasn't to attack them, it was to ignore them. Take away their spotlight and watch how quickly they crumble. In the world of power and influence, the man who constantly needs to be noticed is the easiest to predict and manipulate. Machiavelli's power play, turning weakness into leverage. Machiavelli didn't just identify these behaviors, he used them. He understood that once you can spot a weak man, you can manipulate the situation to your advantage. These three behaviors, the justifier, the pleaser, and the attention addict, were all pieces on a chessboard, and Machiavelli played the game with precision. Instead of fighting these men or exposing them, Machiavelli turned their weaknesses into leverage. He would spot the justifier and listen, giving them the validation they craved. He would turn to the people pleaser and offer him safety, making him feel chosen. And to the display addict, he would give the stage, allowing him to bask in the spotlight while Machiavelli quietly controlled the narrative behind the scenes. By offering just enough emotional candy to keep these men hooked, Machiavelli could shape their behavior without them even realizing it. He turned their desperation for validation into a tool for his own rise. And when the time came, he could withdraw his approval, watch them crumble, and move forward without lifting a finger. Turning weakness into strategy, the art of psychological engineering. Machiavelli's mastery wasn't just in identifying these subtle behaviors, but in understanding how to use them to his advantage. He didn't just expose weakness to defeat it, he used it to build his own power. In his world, the stakes were high, and every move he made had to be calculated. Whether it was in the courts of princes or the offices of business leaders, Machiavelli understood that power isn't just about being strong. It's about recognizing when and how to use the weaknesses of others to your advantage. Machiavelli saw people for what they truly were, not for their titles, their words, or their positions, but for their psychological patterns. He would watch carefully, learning what drove them, what they feared, and what they craved. And once you understand a man's internal desires, you can predict his behavior, shape it, and ultimately control it. This wasn't manipulation in the typical sense. Machiavelli wasn't trying to force people to do his bidding through fear or brute strength. Instead, he recognized that the weak were driven by their insecurities, and by feeding those insecurities, he could make them work for him. When a man fears rejection, he will do anything to gain approval. When a man craves attention, he will sacrifice his integrity for the spotlight. And when a man over-justifies every decision, he will constantly seek validation, making him easy to influence. The beauty of Machiavelli's approach was its subtlety. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a grand spectacle. Instead, he created a system where the weak were so caught up in their own emotional needs that they didn't even realize they were being controlled. It's a game of psychological leverage. Machiavelli knew that if you understood how the weak thought and felt, you could make them your most loyal allies without them even knowing it. This kind of manipulation wasn't about cruelty, it was about strategy. You don't need to break someone to gain their loyalty. You just need to understand what drives them and give them enough of what they crave to keep them close. In Machiavelli's world, power wasn't about dominating others through force. It was about creating a psychological bond that made others dependent on you. They craved your approval, your recognition, and in return, they would do whatever it took to maintain that bond. Machiavelli's playbook, the strategy of silence and invisibility. In the courts of kings and the backrooms of power, one thing stood out about Machiavelli. He never allowed himself to be controlled by his own need for attention. While the men around him scrambled for the spotlight, Machiavelli took a different approach. He understood that true power comes from invisibility. The more you can remain unseen while orchestrating events, the more control you can wield. This strategy of silence is where most people falter. In a world where everyone is shouting for attention, Machiavelli's silence was a weapon. A man who is silent in a room full of noise is a man who is in control. His stillness is more powerful than any boast, any proclamation of strength, because it makes others uncomfortable. When you've mastered silence, you've mastered presence. And presence is a tool that weak men cannot understand. When others are constantly speaking, trying to prove themselves, a man who remains calm and composed creates a stark contrast. The more the others reveal themselves, the more predictable they become. The more they talk, the more they expose their insecurities. But the man who remains silent is the one who can see through it all. He watches, he observes, and when the time comes, he acts with precision. In his own life, Machiavelli practiced this. He didn't speak just to be heard. He didn't take the stage to display his strength. He knew that true strength doesn't need to be announced, it simply is. And when you've mastered this, you become a presence that others can't ignore. They may not know why, but they will feel the weight of your silence. And that's when you know you've truly gained control. The subtle power of boundaries, teaching the weak. Their place Machiavelli didn't just watch the weak men around him, he also used boundaries to control them. This was one of his most powerful tools for maintaining power. You see, weak men are often desperate to be liked, to be accepted, and they will go to great lengths to avoid conflict. Machiavelli understood that if he could set boundaries and keep them rigid, the weak would always fall in line. Boundaries are the foundation of power. A strong man knows when to say no and does so without hesitation. He isn't concerned with whether people like him or not. A weak man, however, will bend and contort himself to make others happy. He will avoid conflict at all costs, even if it means compromising his own values and integrity. Machiavelli used this to his advantage. He knew that if he set clear boundaries with the weak, they would either rise to the challenge or fold under the pressure, and if they folded, it was another indication that they didn't belong in the realm of power. The weak are afraid of confrontation, of standing their ground. They need approval, and without it, they crumble. The art of power is learning when to enforce boundaries and when to let them go. Machiavelli knew that by giving the weak just enough space to feel like they had control, he could subtly guide their behavior. He would give them small victories, small validations, but only on his terms. And when they overstepped those boundaries, he would withdraw his approval, making them desperate for it once again. This constant push and pull created a psychological dance that Machiavelli controlled without ever having to exert force. The weak men would keep performing, keep seeking approval, and in the process, they would bind themselves to him. And when the time came, Machiavelli could use them as pawns in his own grand strategy. The final manipulation. Keeping weak men in the dark. One of the greatest fears Machiavelli had was not betrayal from the strong, but from the weak. He feared the unstable men who would collapse under pressure and then attempt to turn on him. These men were unpredictable, and their loyalty was brittle. To protect himself, Machiavelli didn't just play the game with the weak, he made sure they were never able to see the full picture. He kept them in the dark, feeding them just enough information to keep them obedient, but never enough to make them dangerous. Machiavelli understood that knowledge is power, and by controlling what the weak knew, he kept them from ever being able to threaten him. They might think they understood the game, but they were always a step behind, reacting to his moves without ever fully grasping his strategy. This was the key to maintaining control. By withholding information, Machiavelli ensured that the weak never had the tools they needed to challenge him. They were always playing catch-up, always trying to prove themselves, while he moved silently and decisively behind the scenes. They might win small victories, but in the grand scheme of things, they were always a part of his larger plan. Machiavelli's legacy. Mastering power through psychological insight. So what can we learn from Machiavelli's observations about weak men? It's simple. Power is not about brute strength. It's not about loud proclamations or grand gestures. Power is about understanding the subtle psychological patterns that drive human behavior and using them to your advantage. Machiavelli's genius lay not in his ability to control the strong, but in his ability to control the weak. By recognizing the cracks in the armor of the weak, whether it's over-justification, weaponized niceness, or display addiction, Machiavelli turned these weaknesses into tools. He understood that these behaviors weren't just signs of insecurity. They were leverage points that could be used to shape the world around him. And this is where the true power lies. In the ability to see through the noise, to read between the lines, and to understand the underlying motives of those around you. The weak will always reveal themselves, and when they do, it's up to you to decide whether you will expose them or use them to your advantage. Final thoughts. The art of discernment and mastery over weakness. Machiavelli's greatest lesson is not just how to spot weakness in others, but how to identify it within yourself. After all, if you can't master your own insecurities, your need for validation, your desire for approval, your fear of rejection, then you'll always be susceptible to the same psychological traps that ensnare the weak. The true strength lies in mastering your own emotions, controlling your impulses, and remaining silent in the face of chaos. When you can do that, you become a force to be reckoned with. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to explain yourself to be understood. You simply are. So the next time you encounter someone who over-justifies themselves, who pleases everyone at the cost of their own self-respect, or who craves attention like a drug, remember this. These are not just signs of weakness, they are tools. And if you can learn to read them, you can use them to navigate the world with precision, control, and power. Machiavelli knew this better than anyone. And if you can master the art of identifying and manipulating weakness, you will too. The power of quiet observation. Machiavelli's silence is a strategic tool. While many men are busy putting on displays of strength, seeking recognition, and constantly talking to validate themselves, Machiavelli knew that true power wasn't in the noise. It was in the quiet. This is a concept many in today's world overlook. Everyone is obsessed with being noticed, with climbing the social ladder as quickly as possible. The loudest voices, the most visible personalities, are often the ones who feel the most insecure. And while they are busy broadcasting their every move, the man who masters silence is building something far more valuable: influence. Silence, in Machiavelli's eyes, is not just the absence of noise. It is a weapon. To be able to sit in a room full of people, to listen and observe, and to remain unfazed by the chaos around you is a sign of immense control. Machiavelli understood that silence does not equate to passivity. Rather, it is an active decision. In fact, it often makes others uncomfortable because they cannot predict what you are thinking or what you will do next. This ambiguity gives you power over them. People are drawn to what they don't understand, and when you remain still and quiet, they will try to decipher you. And in that act of trying to figure you out, they make themselves predictable. This is the real mastery Machiavelli was referring to. Not allowing yourself to be a part of the noise, but rather to remain the observer, the calm in the storm. Everyone else's behavior becomes a reflection of their own insecurities. The man who is constantly talking, justifying, and seeking approval reveals his fear of being ignored. But the man who remains quiet holds all the cards. He waits, he listens, and when the time is right, he acts decisively. His silence becomes his statement, more powerful than any word could ever be. By understanding the psychology of silence, Machiavelli showed how to use the behavior of others against them. When you observe carefully, you understand their patterns. You understand what drives them and how they respond to various situations. And once you have that knowledge, you can predict their actions. You can manipulate their responses without ever needing to make a sound. It's not about being louder, it's about being smarter. The illusion of strength, how weak men mask their insecurities with confidence. Let's take a moment to examine another powerful truth about the weak. They often try to mask their insecurity by projecting an image of confidence. We've all seen it. Men who speak loudly, who boast about their accomplishments, who dominate conversations in an attempt to be seen as strong. But the louder they speak, the more they expose their own fragility. The truth is, real confidence doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It doesn't require constant validation from others. It simply is. Machiavelli was acutely aware of this dynamic. He observed how many men would posture in an attempt to assert dominance, but in doing so, they were revealing their greatest weakness, the need to be perceived as strong. He saw this as an emotional crutch, an attempt to fill a void, to cover up the deep-rooted fear that they weren't enough. But here's the thing about strength. It's quiet, it's grounded, and it doesn't need to assert itself to be known. The truly strong men act with purpose and intent, but they don't feel the need to make others aware of their strength. They operate in silence, and their actions speak for them. In a way, the weak man who projects confidence is like a man walking around with an enormous sign that says, "I need approval." His outward displays of strength are often just a mask to cover up his fears and insecurities. Machiavelli saw through this act. He knew that the loudest men in the room were often the most afraid. They were trying to convince others and themselves that they were powerful. But real power doesn't need convincing, it just is. When you encounter a man who is constantly boasting, who talks about his achievements without being prompted, or who insists on showing off his authority, it's a sign that he's not as confident as he wants you to believe. He's covering up a deeper insecurity. Machiavelli would have understood this immediately, recognizing that the louder someone is about their own strength, the less likely it is that they truly possess it. Leverage in leadership, using weakness to guide, not confront. When it comes to leadership, many people mistakenly believe that the best leaders are those who assert their authority the loudest. They believe that a strong leader is one who commands respect through forceful words and actions. However, Machiavelli understood that true leadership doesn't come from commanding. It comes from guiding. And to guide others, you need to understand what drives them, what motivates them, and what weaknesses they are hiding. By recognizing the subtle behaviors of weak men, you can lead them effectively without ever having to raise your voice. The art of leadership lies not in controlling others with force, but in understanding their emotional triggers and using those insights to guide them in the right direction. It's about shaping behavior, not through fear, but through understanding. And the more you understand about the weaknesses of others, the more control you gain. The weak are always seeking validation. They want to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. And a great leader knows how to give them just enough to keep them moving in the right direction without ever letting them realize that they are being guided. This is where Machiavelli's brilliance shines. He didn't just recognize the weaknesses in others. He knew how to use those weaknesses to his advantage, turning them into tools for his own success. By allowing the weak to feel like they are in control, Machiavelli manipulated the entire dynamic in his favor. He made them think they were leading, when in reality they were following his cues all along. This is the true essence of leadership, knowing when to step back and let others take the lead, while subtly steering them towards your ultimate goal. The psychology of performance, how the weak live for validation. One of the most profound insights Machiavelli had was his understanding of the psychology of performance. Many men perform throughout their lives, desperately seeking attention, approval, and recognition. They are constantly trying to prove their worth to others, often without realizing that their performance is the very thing that exposes their weakness. Performance in this sense is an emotional mask, a way to cover up insecurities and fears. For the weak man, performance is everything. He's the one who exaggerates every victory, who needs to be constantly praised, who turns every moment into a spectacle. But the more he performs, the more he exposes himself. He needs others to validate his existence. Without that external validation, he feels empty. And this emptiness is exactly what Machiavelli knew how to exploit. Machiavelli understood that the weak man's need for attention was his greatest vulnerability. They will do anything to maintain the spotlight, even if it means betraying their own principles. The man who craves validation is the easiest to manipulate because he is desperate for the approval of others. And once you understand that, you can use it to your advantage. This idea of performance addiction is not just about attention, it's about identity. For the weak, their identity is shaped entirely by how others perceive them. They have no internal foundation to rely on. Their self-worth is entirely dependent on external recognition. Machiavelli saw this as a dangerous flaw. These men were liabilities because their identities were fragile and could be manipulated. The final stage, mastering the art of control through strategic withdrawal. After all these strategies, the final stage of Machiavelli's approach was one of the most powerful tactics he employed, strategic withdrawal. This is where you withdraw your attention, your approval, your validation, and let the weak man crumble under the pressure. By withholding your approval, you force them to face their own fears. They become desperate, scrambling to regain what they lost. The real power here is not in giving or taking. It's in the ability to make others feel that your approval is scarce and therefore valuable. Once the weak man becomes addicted to your approval, you have them. You control their actions without having to make a single command. They will do whatever it takes to gain back what they once had. Machiavelli understood this better than anyone. He knew that the most powerful move was not to confront the weak head-on, but to withdraw. Let them chase you. Let them come to you. And in doing so, you make them work for your approval. You turn them into puppets, and you pull the strings without them even realizing it. They will follow you because they believe they need you. And in this belief, you gain complete control. The paradox of power, embracing weakness to rise above it. Machiavelli's approach was not just about controlling others. It was about mastering yourself. He recognized that in order to understand and manipulate the weaknesses of others, you must first confront your own. It's a paradox. To control weakness, you must first embrace it, recognize it, and remove it from within yourself. Only then can you truly rise above it. This self-awareness is the key to Machiavelli's success. It's easy to point out the flaws in others, but it's far more difficult to confront your own. Once you've mastered your own insecurities, your need for approval, your desire for recognition, your fear of rejection, you will no longer be vulnerable to the weaknesses that control so many. And this is what gives you true power, the ability to act without fear, to speak without the need for validation, and to move without hesitation. As you apply these principles to your own life, remember that the greatest power is not in controlling others, but in controlling yourself. When you can do that, you will have the strength to manipulate the world around you without ever lifting a finger. The power of subtlety, creating influence through unspoken command. In Machiavelli's world, power was not something that was explicitly claimed. It was something that was subtly earned. And this is where he made a distinct point. While many leaders try to exert their influence through sheer force, volume, or dominance, Machiavelli understood that true control doesn't require the loudest voice. It doesn't require grandiose statements or public displays. Instead, it requires subtlety. Subtlety, in this case, is the ability to influence without overtly showing your hand. You don't need to make a big show of your intelligence, your strategy, or your power. Instead, you let the circumstances and the people around you reveal your strength. The more you can operate under the radar, the more powerful you become. What Machiavelli taught was the art of remaining unseen while exerting influence. When you learn to use the invisible forces of manipulation, those subtle cues, the quiet nods, the soft commands, you start to control situations without anyone realizing it. This is not about deception. It's about being perceptive and knowing how to act without needing to announce yourself. The more you step into the shadows, the more others are compelled to follow the path you've set before them. Why does this work? Because people inherently trust the unseen more than the obvious. A person who stays behind the scenes appears to have nothing to prove. Their silence speaks volumes about their confidence, and people tend to listen to those who seem calm and collected, not those who constantly seek validation through speech. This method of leadership, according to Machiavelli, is the most effective way to rise above the fray and dominate without ever having to make a scene. Machiavelli's example was clear. Those who were constantly at the forefront, shouting their plans to the world, often found themselves overtaken by others who worked from the shadows. They were predictable. They showed their cards too early. Their position was vulnerable. The master manipulator, however, sat back, observed, and let the chaos unfold, all the while controlling the outcome. Understanding human nature, the weak man's desire for control. One of Machiavelli's greatest insights into the psyche of weak men was their insatiable desire for control. It's paradoxical, but men who are weak often seek control the most because they fear losing it. This fear is their driving force. Everything they do is to gain and maintain control. They will try to dominate conversations, steer situations, and assert themselves whenever possible. But this desire for control is a telltale sign of their weakness. A man who truly possesses power has no need to control every situation or every person around him. He understands that control is an illusion. It is impossible to control everything. Instead, the truly powerful man works with the flow of events. He adapts, he adjusts, and he moves forward without trying to bend everything around him to his will. Machiavelli saw this desire for control in many men he encountered, especially in those who surrounded themselves with sycophants and yes men. They could not stand to be in a position where they weren't the center of attention or where things were not going according to their design. This constant need for control, for dominance, was an indication of their fear of losing power. They were insecure at their core, constantly fighting against the anxiety of being irrelevant. Machiavelli himself, in his strategic maneuvering, used this to his advantage. He understood that the weak man who craves control is predictable. His behavior is easy to anticipate because he is always acting out of fear. And once you understand his fears, you can manipulate him. You can give him the illusion of control, making him feel powerful while you quietly pull the strings from behind the scenes. This is where Machiavelli's strategic brilliance comes into play. Rather than trying to overpower these weak men, he allowed them to think they were in charge. By giving them just enough of what they needed, attention, approval, recognition, he was able to control their actions. They would act in his favor, believing it was their decision, when in fact they were playing right into his hand. This psychological manipulation, while subtle, is one of the most effective ways to turn weakness into a tool for your own rise. The fragility of reputation, how weak men's reputation is built on perception. Another fascinating aspect of Machiavelli's teachings is the importance of reputation. In his world, reputation was everything. A man's reputation could elevate him, but it could also destroy him if it was misused. For weak men, their entire identity is often wrapped up in their reputation. They crave the approval of others so much that they become obsessed with how they are perceived. And this obsession with reputation is a sign of weakness. The weak man, on the other hand, lives in constant fear of losing his reputation. He spends his days shaping and reshaping his image, trying to maintain an illusion of strength. He does whatever it takes to be seen as powerful, even if it means lying, cheating, or manipulating others. He will go to extreme lengths to maintain his reputation, even if it costs him his integrity. Machiavelli knew that this obsession with reputation was a vulnerability. The weak man's reputation is fragile because it is built on a foundation of insecurity. It is dependent on the opinions of others, and when those opinions change, so does his sense of self-worth. Machiavelli understood that once a man's reputation is built on false pretenses, it can be easily torn down. And he knew that in order to control these men, he could simply attack their reputation. By undermining their image, he could make them crumble. The false promise of self-promotion. Weak men who seek external validation. One of the greatest weaknesses Machiavelli identified in men was their insatiable need for external validation. In the courts of Europe, men were constantly vying for power, trying to one-up each other, and seeking validation from the people around them. This need for validation is not just about ego. It's a deep, subconscious fear of being irrelevant. A weak man fears that if no one notices him, he will cease to matter. Machiavelli saw this fear as the foundation of self-promotion. Men would constantly talk about their accomplishments, exaggerate their importance, and name-drop in an attempt to gain the approval of others. But this self-promotion was a form of weakness. The truly powerful man does not need to announce his importance to the world. He simply is. His actions speak louder than any words ever could. The weak man, on the other hand, seeks constant reassurance. He craves the approval of others because he lacks confidence in himself. He will boast about his achievements, seeking validation from those around him. He needs others to tell him that he is important, that he is worthy, because deep down he is uncertain. And this uncertainty is his greatest weakness. Machiavelli used this understanding to his advantage. He knew that men who constantly sought validation were easy to manipulate because they were so dependent on others' opinions. He would allow them to seek that validation, give them small doses of approval, and in doing so, he controlled their behavior. They would act in his favor, believing they were earning his respect, when in reality, they were simply playing into his hands. The unseen force of influence, shaping behavior from behind the curtain. At the core of Machiavelli's brilliance was his ability to shape behavior from behind the curtain. He understood that the best kind of influence is the one that goes unnoticed. The most effective leaders are those who can guide others without them even realizing it. They manipulate not through force, but through psychological cues, creating a world where their influence is felt without being seen. When Machiavelli moved through the courts, he didn't just exert power by being in the room. He exerted power by being the invisible force behind every decision. He knew that the men around him, though loud and eager for attention, were easy to manipulate. They were predictable because they were always reacting to their own insecurities. Machiavelli, however, didn't react. He was always a step ahead, orchestrating events from behind the scenes. This is the true art of influence, knowing how to guide others without them realizing it. When you understand their fears, their insecurities, and their desires, you can shape their actions without ever saying a word. The weak will follow their own desires, and by understanding those desires, you can predict their moves before they even make them. Conclusion: mastery over self and others. As we conclude this exploration of Machiavelli's insights into weakness, we are left with a profound lesson. To understand others, we must first understand ourselves. The true power in Machiavelli's teachings comes from recognizing the weaknesses within ourselves, our need for validation, our fears of rejection, our desire for approval, and confronting them head-on. Only then can we truly master the art of influence. Machiavelli's genius was not just in identifying the weaknesses of others, but in mastering his own weaknesses. He understood that the greatest strength comes from self-mastery. By removing all traces of insecurity and fear from within, he was able to rise above the manipulations of others and build his own empire through psychological strategy. And so, the lesson remains. Strength isn't about dominance or aggression. It's about control, discipline, and mastery. When you master yourself, you master others. When you control your fears, you control the world around you. This is the true power Machiavelli taught, and it's a lesson that has stood the test of time.